Hi, this is Rick Hedeman with RSA, the Security Division of EMC. In the last two videos, we talked a bit about GRC and we talked a bit about Archer, the Archer GRC platform, and the architecture behind it. In this video, we're going to bring it full circle and we're going to talk a bit about how customers actually use the product to solve their problems. Specifically, I'm going to address a couple of modules here, starting with policy management. So if we think about a particular use case around policy management, let's take, for instance, security awareness. That's something that every organization has to address. How often do their employees actually get trained on security awareness, and do they actually take the training, and do they actually pass the training, and so on? And are our customers asking whether our employees are actually taking this training, because perhaps they're dealing with their data and their sensitive data. So in terms of how that applies to Archer, that might be a policy that has to be defined, penned, authorized, and then mapped to a particular subset. Perhaps it's done by geography, perhaps it's done by business unit, perhaps it's done by data type. Maybe there's a group of data that's a lot more sensitive than another type of data. So those policies get penned, managed, they have to be authorized, and then applied to particular entities within your environment. And then ultimately, we need to be able to assess whether that policy is actually successful or not. So an assessment within Archer could be developed, sent out to a representative sample, for instance, of employees, and then check, did you take this? Did you pass? On the flip side, we could pull that information in from an educational system, right, and map it to your actual assets, people assets within your organization. So there's an example where a real-life problem could be managed within the policy management solution within Archer. Another example within compliance management is a very common one, and that is password strength. So let's say, we all know passwords, may need to be 8 characters or 10 characters, or have special characters or not have special characters. If you look at the requirements for password strength, there are some prescriptive requirements from a compliance perspective. HIPAA has some, PCI has some. There are requirements around privacy, FISMA. There are many different sort of compliance requirements that specifically say your password policy needs to be this length. Well, they're not all the same. But we can find a baseline password policy, call it greater than 8 characters, for instance. If this is satisfied, then we can be assured that it's satisfied for each one of these compliance requirements. Well, this requirement then can get mapped to every asset in your organization. I mean, think about it. You've got mobile assets, you've got servers, you've got firewalls, you've got storage systems, you've got security systems, you have tons and tons of different assets that all have password policies associated with them. Well, the auditor, the HIPAA auditor comes along and says, are you compliant with your password policy? And you come to this and you say, well, geez, I need to go understand how I'm compliant to all of these entities within our organization. Okay, I can answer that question. I say I am compliant. Well, then the PCI auditor comes along. The privacy auditor comes along. The FISMA auditor comes along. They're all asking the same questions. We don't want to have to go query our environment each time. This mapping here is what RSA content keeps up to date and adds to. This mapping here is what your customer, keeps current in your environment. This is something that we maintain and is a lot of work and effort, and this automatically maps it to the environment. So here's an example where the compliance management solution allows you to effectively do a one-to-many test, satisfy, kind of scenario and save a ton of time. Particularly, these are very extensive in heavily regulated industries and sort of industries that cover different segments. So you don't have just healthcare or people who process credit cards. You have healthcare providers that process credit cards and so on, and deal with privacy information, and are dealing with federal contractors and so on. So that's an example of compliance management. I'll give you an example of incident management. So this is a real example at EMC. We are a level 1 PCI vendor. We have credit card information in our infrastructure, and we were interested in where that credit card information was. So we scanned our infrastructure with DLP, and we found 25,000 instances of that credit card data across 1,200 users. Well, that became a big incident for us. But the real question is, now what? How do you manage that incident? Who gets updated? How do you know what the status is? How do you automate that process? We did it within Archer. So we created a single incident. We developed a campaign against users, which we pulled in through a data feed so we know who owned what. And then we sent them a survey and said, do you really need this data? And this is why. And you have a couple of different options. You can either argue that you ought to keep the data. You can delete the data. But know that we're not going away, and we're going to come back until you deal with that data in one way or another that satisfies our policies around that and our compliance that we're requiring around PCI. We were able to resolve that in a sort of full circle manner within 90% of it within 3 months, which was a huge win for our internal IT group. And the thing that was particularly important is it was the business users making those decisions. And it wasn't the IT group being the bad guy. It was the business users who needed the data saying, I either need it or I don't need it. It's not down to IT to be the bad guy. So Archer, in that case, really bridged the gap between the business requirements and the technologists here. And that's a really key value proposition. So just a few things to summarize. Archer provides very fast time to value in the order of weeks, not months. It's configuration, not development. And that's a key point here. So the applications are drag and drop. The configurations on screen are right-click mouse type configurations. Even the calculations are all Excel kind of based. So you do not require programming capabilities to be able to do that kind of configuration. And that's true for the reporting and all the other pieces as well. So that's really important. Sort of in summary, I hope that this addresses your questions around GRC and how Archer fits into the whole GRC space. From a target market perspective, we really see this being regulated industries, industries that are subject to a wide variety of regulations, so maybe just not tight regulations, but a wide variety of regulations, as well as industries that have a lot of intellectual property that they're trying to manage and maintain, so looking at the risk associated with that intellectual property. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to your EMC Alliance counterparts and they can get a hold of us. Thanks.